The start of World War II was a moment of profound upheaval, a turning point that would plunge the world into a conflict of unprecedented scale and devastation. This war, which began officially on September 1st, 1939, after Germany's invasion of Poland, did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of mounting tensions, unresolved conflicts, and an environment that fostered the rise of aggressive, authoritarian regimes. The roots of World War II stretched back to the aftermath of World War I, a time marked by political instability, economic hardship, and the fragile peace imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. This fragile peace, filled with resentment and frustration, became fertile ground for leaders like Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and militaristic factions in Japan to assert their vision of power and dominance. Across Europe and Asia, nationalism and militarism took hold, leading to a series of events that would erode the boundaries between peace and war. Germany, under Hitler's Nazi regime, rearmed in open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles and expanded its territory through aggressive and coercive tactics. Italy, led by Mussolini, sought to revive the Roman Empire, asserting control over territories in North Africa and allying itself with Germany. In the East, Japan pursued expansion throughout Asia, driven by a desire for resources and control, starting with its occupation of Manchuria in 1931. These regimes, each with their own ambitions, shared a willingness to use force, a disregard for international diplomacy, and a determination to reshape the world according to their own ideologies. The rise of these powers led to a tense and uncertain geopolitical landscape. Efforts to maintain peace, such as the League of Nations and the policy of appeasement, proved ineffective against the relentless expansionism of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Diplomatic agreements, like the Munich Agreement and the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, attempted to delay conflict but ultimately emboldened the aggressors. The final spark came with the invasion of Poland, an act that Britain and France could no longer ignore. Within days, Europe was once again at war, and soon the conflict would spread, drawing in nations from across the globe and reshaping the course of history. Understanding the start of World War II requires a look at the complex interplay of political, economic, and ideological factors that led to the outbreak of hostilities. It is a story of rising powers, failed diplomacy, and the high cost of unchecked aggression. In exploring these events, we gain insight into the forces that shaped the 20th century and the lessons that still resonate today. A reminder of the importance of vigilance, diplomacy, and the pursuit of peace in a world all too easily swayed by the drums of war. Chapter 1: The Legacy of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. The end of World War I in 1918 marked both a victory and a loss for Europe. While the guns had fallen silent and an armistice had been signed, the continent was left in ruins, physically, economically, and psychologically. Nearly an entire generation of young men had perished on the battlefields, cities lay in rubble, economies were strained, and governments were fragile. Europe, once a center of global power, was now struggling to regain its footing in the wake of an unprecedented catastrophe. In an attempt to establish lasting peace, world leaders gathered in 1919 at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris to draft a peace treaty. The resulting Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, sought to ensure that Germany, the perceived aggressor of World War I, would be held accountable for the destruction caused by the war. However, rather than creating a sustainable peace, the treaty imposed terms that would leave Germany economically crippled, socially fractured, and politically volatile, sowing the seeds of resentment that would eventually lead to World War II. The Treaty of Versailles. Punishment and Humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles was a complex document filled with clauses that were meant to restrict Germany's ability to wage war. Some of the most punishing terms included the following: territorial losses. Germany was forced to surrender large portions of its territory. The provinces of Alsace and Lorraine were returned to France, and other regions, such as the Saar Basin and the Rhineland, were placed under international control or demilitarized. Germany also lost all its overseas colonies, which were distributed among the Allied powers, primarily Britain and France. Military restrictions. The treaty strictly limited the size and capabilities of the German military. The German army was capped at 100,000 men and was forbidden from possessing tanks, heavy artillery, submarines, or an air force. The navy was restricted to a small fleet of ships for coastal defense, effectively removing Germany as a military threat, at least on paper. Reparations. Germany was required to pay massive reparations to the Allied nations to compensate for the damage caused during the war. The exact amount was set at 132 billion gold marks, approximately 33 billion at the time, a staggering sum that put enormous strain on Germany's already battered economy. These payments would become a crushing burden, fueling economic turmoil that contributed to social instability. The War Guilt Clause. Article 231 of the treaty, known as the War Guilt Clause, required Germany to accept full responsibility for causing the war. This clause was particularly humiliating and fostered deep resentment among the German population, who felt that they had been unfairly blamed for a conflict that had involved multiple nations. The War Guilt Clause not only humiliated Germany, but also provided the justification for the severe reparations imposed on them. Economic hardship and social unrest in Germany. The effects of the Treaty of Versailles were immediate and devastating for Germany. The loss of territory, resources, and markets crippled the economy, while the reparations burden led to an economic crisis that would affect all aspects of German life. By the early 1920s, Germany faced hyperinflation of unprecedented levels. In 1923, the German mark became so devalued that it took billions of marks to purchase a loaf of bread. People's life savings evaporated overnight, and pensions became worthless. Desperation spread across the country, leading to widespread poverty and a deep sense of betrayal. The psychological impact of the Treaty of Versailles was equally profound. Many Germans viewed the treaty as a diktat, a dictated peace that had been forced upon them without negotiation or representation. This sentiment was echoed by German leaders who condemned the treaty as a betrayal, arguing that Germany had been treated unjustly and denied a fair chance at rebuilding. The humiliations of Versailles became a rallying point for nationalist groups who claimed that Germany's honor and dignity had been trampled by foreign powers. The rise of nationalism and militarism in Germany. The widespread discontent in Germany provided fertile ground for nationalist and militarist ideologies to take root. A sense of betrayal, victimhood, and desperation fueled a wave of nationalist fervor. Many Germans believed that their suffering was the result of foreign interference and the weakness of their own government, which they felt had failed to defend Germany's honor. These sentiments were soon channeled by radical groups, who promised to restore Germany to greatness by rejecting the terms of Versailles and reclaiming the nation's lost power and pride. One of the most influential figures to emerge from this climate of resentment was Adolf Hitler, a former soldier who had witnessed the devastation of World War I firsthand. Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, which would later become the Nazi Party, and quickly rose to prominence with his fiery speeches against the Treaty of Versailles, the perceived betrayal of the German government, and the threats posed by minority groups within Germany. Hitler's rhetoric tapped into the anger and disillusionment of the German people, presenting himself as the leader who could restore Germany's honor and reject the oppressive terms of Versailles. In the early 1930s, as the Great Depression worsened the economic crisis, Hitler's message gained increasing appeal. The Nazi Party capitalized on the widespread unemployment, poverty, and discontent that plagued Germany, positioning itself as the only force capable of reversing Germany's decline. By promising to rebuild the economy, restore the military, and reclaim Germany's lost territories, Hitler gained support from millions of Germans who saw him as a savior. The treaty's impact on Italy and Japan. The Treaty of Versailles also left Italy and Japan disillusioned, despite both nations being among the victorious allies. Italy had entered World War I with the expectation of gaining territory and influence, yet it received little in return, fueling nationalist resentment and a desire for greater power. Benito Mussolini, who would become Italy's fascist dictator, capitalized on this dissatisfaction by promising to restore Italy's glory and build a new Roman Empire. Mussolini's expansionist ambitions would eventually draw Italy into an alliance with Germany, leading to the formation of the Axis powers. Japan, too, felt slighted by the Treaty of Versailles. Despite its significant contributions to the Allied war effort, Japan's territorial ambitions in Asia were largely ignored by Western powers. Frustrated by what they perceived as racial discrimination and exclusion from the benefits of victory, Japan turned toward militarism and began expanding its influence throughout East Asia. This ambition would lead to conflicts with China, Russia, and eventually the United States, making Japan a key player in the global conflicts to come. The Treaty of Versailles, a catalyst for conflict. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to secure peace, became a catalyst for future conflict. Its punitive terms left Germany economically weakened, politically unstable, and socially fractured. The treaty's failure to address the aspirations of Italy and Japan further contributed to an environment of resentment and unfulfilled ambitions. In attempting to prevent another war, the Treaty of Versailles sowed the seeds for an even greater one, as bitterness and nationalism festered in Germany, Italy, and Japan. By the 1930s, the consequences of the treaty had set the stage for a new era of aggression and expansionism. The desire to overturn the Treaty of Versailles and reclaim lost pride would become a central tenet of Nazi Germany's ideology, guiding its policies and ambitions. As nationalist leaders in Germany, Italy, and Japan rose to power, each driven by a desire to rewrite the terms imposed upon them and secure their place in the world, the pieces were set in motion for a conflict that would once again plunge the world into darkness. The legacy of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles thus became a prelude to World War II. This time, however, the consequences would be far more devastating, reshaping the world and leaving scars that would last for generations. Chapter 2: The Rise of Totalitarian Regimes. As the world struggled to recover from the impact of World War I and the economic turmoil of the Great Depression, a wave of totalitarian regimes emerged, promising order, strength, and a new vision for national greatness. Driven by charismatic and authoritarian leaders, These regimes took hold in Germany, Italy, and Japan, each with ambitions of expansion and domination that would soon clash with the fragile peace of the post-war world. United by a shared disdain for democracy and international diplomacy, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and militarist factions in Japan pursued aggressive policies that set the stage for global conflict. Germany under Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. In Germany, the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party was fueled by a combination of economic hardship, nationalist fervor, and resentment toward the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler, a powerful orator and former soldier, joined the German Workers' Party, which he soon transformed into the Nazi Party in the early 1920s. He quickly garnered support with his passionate speeches condemning the Treaty of Versailles, blaming it for Germany's suffering and promising to restore the nation's lost pride and power. Hitler's vision for Germany was rooted in a radical nationalist ideology, marked by militarism, racial purity, and the belief in the superiority of the so-called Aryan race. As Germany descended further into economic crisis during the Great Depression, Hitler's popularity surged. The Nazi Party promised to restore economic stability, create jobs, and revive national pride, capturing the hopes of millions of Germans who saw Hitler as a savior. By 1933, he had ascended to the role of chancellor, quickly consolidating power and transforming Germany into a totalitarian state. The Enabling Act, passed that year, granted him dictatorial powers, and he wasted no time in dismantling democratic institutions, silencing opposition, and establishing a ruthless police state. Hitler's expansionist ambitions became evident early in his rule. He sought to create Lebensraum, living space for the German people, by expanding eastward into Eastern Europe and Russia. This concept was grounded in the belief that Germans were entitled to land occupied by inferior races, who would either be removed or subjugated to serve the German state. By openly defying the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler began to rearm Germany, building a powerful military capable of enforcing his vision. The German economy was reshaped to support this military buildup, and propaganda spread the Nazi ideology across the nation, solidifying Hitler's control and preparing the population for war. Italy under Benito Mussolini and the fascist regime. In Italy, dissatisfaction with the Treaty of Versailles and post-war economic struggles provided fertile ground for the rise of Benito Mussolini, a former socialist who founded the Fascist Party in 1919. Mussolini's vision for Italy was rooted in the concept of restoring the glory of the ancient Roman Empire. His ideology, which he called fascism, emphasized extreme nationalism, authoritarianism, and the supremacy of the state over individual rights. He rejected both democracy and communism, viewing them as weak and incompatible with Italy's aspirations for power and influence. Mussolini gained support by promising to restore Italy's strength and prestige. By 1922, he had gathered enough influence to march on Rome with his paramilitary black shirts, an event that led to King Victor Emmanuel III appointing him as prime minister. Over the next few years, Mussolini consolidated power, dismantling democratic institutions, censoring the press, and silencing opposition. Like Hitler, he ruled through fear and propaganda, promoting himself as Italy's supreme leader, or Il Duce, and positioning fascism as the only path to national rejuvenation. Mussolini's ambitions extended beyond Italy's borders. He sought to establish a new Roman Empire by expanding into North Africa and the Mediterranean. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, an independent African nation, in a brutal campaign that violated international law and drew global condemnation. Despite the League of Nations imposing economic sanctions, the invasion underscored the ineffectiveness of international diplomacy in curbing aggression. Italy's conquest of Ethiopia strengthened Mussolini's resolve and further aligned Italy with Nazi Germany, setting the stage for their eventual alliance in the Axis powers. Japan's militaristic expansion and imperial ambitions. Meanwhile, in Japan, a different but equally aggressive vision was taking shape. Following World War I, Japan's leaders felt frustrated by their limited gains despite their support of the Allies. Japan's economy was growing, but it lacked access to the natural resources necessary to sustain its industrial ambitions. A powerful military faction within the Japanese government advocated for expansion into Asia and the Pacific, seeking to establish Japan as the dominant power in the region. In 1931, Japan took its first major step toward expansion by occupying Manchuria, a region rich in resources, which they renamed Manchukuo and set up as a puppet state. This invasion marked Japan's departure from international cooperation and was a clear rejection of the League of Nations authority. When the League condemned Japan's actions, Japan simply withdrew from the organization, emboldening the militarists who saw conquest as the only solution to Japan's resource shortages and overpopulation. The Japanese government, under increasing military influence, promoted the idea of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vision of an Asia free of Western influence and led by Japan. This ambition drove Japan to expand further, leading to conflicts with China, including the full-scale invasion of 1937, marked by atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre. Japan's expansionist policies and growing hostility toward Western powers set it on a collision course with the United States and Britain, which had interests in Asia and the Pacific, shared ideologies, and the road to alliance. Although Germany, Italy, and Japan were culturally and politically distinct, they shared a number of core principles that would ultimately bring them together in an alliance known as the Axis powers. All three regimes were intensely nationalist, expansionist, and opposed to the Western democratic order. They rejected the principles of international cooperation, viewing diplomacy as a weakness and championing military force as the path to power and respect. Germany and Italy formalized their alliance with the Pact of Steel in 1939, a treaty that bound them together in military cooperation and committed each nation to support the other in war. Japan, though initially hesitant to join, would later align with Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact of 1940. Together, the Axis powers would present a united front, coordinating their efforts to dominate Europe, Asia, and beyond. The rise of these totalitarian regimes marked a departure from the traditional balance of power in Europe and Asia. Through propaganda, repression, and aggressive policies, Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese militarists reshaped their nations into powerful war machines, each driven by an ideology that glorified conflict and conquest. Their collective ambition threatened the peace and stability of the world, and their shared disdain for democracy and diplomacy set them on a path to war. The warning signs ignored. The rise of these regimes did not go unnoticed, but the Western democracies were slow to respond. The Great Depression had left countries like Britain, France, and the United States focused inward, preoccupied with their own economic recovery. The horrors of World War I still loomed large in the public consciousness, and few leaders had the appetite for another costly war. As a result, the aggressive actions of Germany, Italy, and Japan were met with hesitance and, ultimately, appeasement. The Western powers' reluctance to confront these regimes emboldened Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan's militarists, reinforcing their belief that they could pursue their ambitions without consequence. This failure to act in the face of growing aggression would prove costly, as the totalitarian regimes continued to expand their reach and set the stage for the conflict that would soon engulf the world. Chapter 3. Failed Diplomacy and the Policy of Appeasement. As Germany, Italy, and Japan pursued aggressive expansion, the Western democracies, primarily Britain and France, found themselves facing a dilemma: how to respond to the actions of these totalitarian regimes without plunging the world into another war. The horrors of World War I were still fresh in public memory, and the desire to avoid another devastating conflict ran deep. This led to the adoption of appeasement as a diplomatic strategy, a policy aimed at placating the aggressors through concessions in the hope that they would be satisfied and avoid further expansion. However, as history would show, this strategy ultimately emboldened the Axis powers, signaling that their ambitions would go unchallenged. The League of Nations, a noble but weak institution. The League of Nations, established in 1920 as part of the Treaty of Versailles, was created with the goal of maintaining peace and preventing future conflicts through diplomacy, collective security, and arbitration. It was the world's first intergovernmental organization dedicated to global peace, and its founders envisioned a new era in which international disputes could be resolved without resorting to war. However, the League had several critical weaknesses that would undermine its effectiveness from the start. First, the League's decisions required unanimous consent from all major powers, making it difficult to reach decisive agreements. Second, the United States, which had championed the League's creation, chose not to join due to domestic political opposition. This absence weakened the League's authority, as it lacked the full support of the world's leading economic and military power. Without the United States and with limited enforcement capabilities, the League was unable to respond effectively to acts of aggression by its members or by external powers. The League's inability to prevent acts of aggression became apparent with Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Japan, seeking to expand its influence in Asia, staged an incident on the South Manchuria Railway and used it as a pretext to occupy the region. When the League of Nations condemned Japan's actions, Japan simply withdrew from the organization, facing no significant consequences for its aggression. This failure to act set a dangerous precedent, signaling to other nations that the League lacked the means to enforce its ideals of collective security. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. In 1935, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia further exposed the weaknesses of international diplomacy. Benito Mussolini, eager to expand Italy's empire, targeted Ethiopia, one of the few remaining independent nations in Africa. Italy's use of brutal tactics, including chemical weapons, shocked the world and drew widespread condemnation. Ethiopia, a member of the League of Nations, appealed to the organization for help. The League responded by imposing economic sanctions on Italy, but these sanctions were limited and failed to impact Italy's war machine significantly. Critical resources like oil, which Italy needed to continue its invasion, were not included in the sanctions. Britain and France, though opposed to Italy's actions, were reluctant to enforce stricter measures due to their desire to maintain Italy as a potential ally against Germany. The result was a half-hearted response that did little to deter Mussolini, who successfully completed his conquest of Ethiopia. Once again, the League's failure emboldened the aggressors, demonstrating that its ability to uphold peace was weak and inconsistent. The policy of appeasement and its rationale. The policy of appeasement became the cornerstone of British and French diplomacy throughout the 1930s. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and other leaders believed that making concessions to Germany, Italy, and Japan would prevent further conflict. The goal was to avoid another catastrophic war by allowing the totalitarian regimes to achieve certain territorial aims, hoping that this would satisfy their expansionist ambitions. There were several factors that motivated the policy of appeasement. The trauma of World War I. The collective memory of the devastation wrought by World War I made European leaders hesitant to confront the Axis powers militarily. The widespread belief was that another war would be even more destructive and costly, a risk that Britain and France were not willing to take. Economic constraints. The Great Depression had left many countries, including Britain and France, economically weakened. Massive unemployment and strained national budgets made rearmament difficult. Appeasement was seen as a practical solution that would avoid war without requiring costly military expansion. Perceived threat of communism. Many in Britain and France viewed communism, particularly in the Soviet Union, as a greater threat than fascism. Hitler's anti-communist stance led some Western leaders to believe that Germany could serve as a buffer against the spread of communism in Europe. This perception led them to overlook or downplay the threat posed by Nazi Germany's militarism. Underestimation of Axis ambitions. British and French leaders believed that Hitler's demands were limited to reversing the Treaty of Versailles and reclaiming German-speaking territories. They underestimated the extent of his expansionist aims and assumed that satisfying his demands would prevent further conflict. The Munich Agreement and the fate of Czechoslovakia. The policy of appeasement reached its peak with the Munich Agreement of 1938. Hitler had long desired the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia inhabited by ethnic Germans. Claiming that the ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland were being persecuted, Hitler demanded the region's annexation to Germany. Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, agreed to negotiate with Hitler, leading to the Munich Conference. At the Munich Conference, held in September 1938, Chamberlain, French Premier Édouard Daladier, Italian leader Benito Mussolini, and Hitler met to discuss the fate of Czechoslovakia. The Czechoslovak government was not invited to the negotiations and had no say in the outcome. The resulting Munich Agreement allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise that he had no further territorial ambitions in Europe. Upon returning to Britain, Chamberlain famously proclaimed that the Munich Agreement had secured peace for our time. However, this peace was short-lived. The annexation of the Sudetenland weakened Czechoslovakia militarily and emboldened Hitler, who saw the West's willingness to compromise as a sign of weakness. In March 1939, just months after the Munich Agreement, Hitler violated his promises by occupying the remainder of Czechoslovakia, demonstrating that appeasement had failed to curb his ambitions. The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, the final diplomatic breakdown. In August 1939, as tensions in Europe reached a boiling point, Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. This agreement, which included a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, guaranteed that the two powers would not attack each other. Hitler's pact with Stalin removed the last significant obstacle to his planned invasion of Poland, as it ensured that Germany would not face a two-front war. This agreement marked the final collapse of diplomacy, as it made clear that Hitler was preparing for war. The non-aggression pact stunned Britain and France, who had hoped that the Soviet Union would support efforts to contain Germany. It also shattered any remaining illusions that Hitler could be appeased, or that peace could be preserved through negotiation. The stage was now set for the outbreak of World War II. Consequences of appeasement. The policy of appeasement, though motivated by a desire to maintain peace, ultimately emboldened the totalitarian regimes and allowed them to expand their influence unchecked. By yielding to Hitler's demands, Britain and France had unintentionally signaled that they were unwilling or unable to confront aggression, paving the way for further escalations. The failure of appeasement is now widely regarded as a cautionary tale in diplomacy. By prioritizing short-term peace over addressing the root causes of aggression, Britain and France had allowed Germany, Italy, and Japan to grow stronger, more confident, and more ruthless in their ambitions. The diplomatic efforts of the 1930s, aimed at preventing another world war, instead contributed to the conditions that made one inevitable. As we move to the next chapter, we will explore how these unchecked ambitions finally erupted into open conflict, as Hitler's invasion of Poland pushed Europe beyond the tipping point and ignited World War II. Chapter 4. The Invasion of Poland, the Spark of War. By the summer of 1939, Europe was on the brink of war. Germany, under Adolf Hitler's aggressive leadership, had already violated the Treaty of Versailles and expanded its territory, seizing Austria and then Czechoslovakia. These expansions had been met with minimal resistance from the Western powers, thanks to the policy of appeasement. Now, however, Hitler set his sights on Poland, a nation with whom Britain and France had pledged to support in the event of an invasion. The invasion of Poland, launched on September 1, 1939, would be the final act that propelled the world into the most devastating conflict in history, World War II. The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, securing the East. On August 23, 1939, just days before Germany's planned invasion of Poland, Hitler secured an agreement with an unlikely ally, the Soviet Union. Known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, this agreement between Hitler and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin stunned the world. Ideologically opposed, Nazi Germany being a fascist state and the Soviet Union a communist one, the two powers were seen as natural enemies. But both leaders saw strategic advantages in this arrangement. The pact included a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, with Poland split along the Vistula and Narew rivers. The Soviet Union would gain control of the eastern half of Poland, along with the Baltic states, while Germany would control the western half. This agreement ensured that Germany would not face a two-front war if it invaded Poland, and it gave the Soviet Union the green light to expand its influence in Eastern Europe. For Stalin, the pact provided time to strengthen his military, which had been weakened by purges within the Soviet armed forces. For Hitler, the agreement eliminated the risk of Soviet intervention, clearing the way for an invasion of Poland without fear of Soviet retaliation. With this assurance, Hitler felt emboldened to proceed with his plans for conquest. The Gleiwitz Incident, creating a pretext for war. On the night of August 31, 1939, Nazi forces staged a provocative event designed to give Germany a pretext for invading Poland. Known as the Gleiwitz Incident, the operation was masterminded by Heinrich Himmler and other Nazi officials as part of a larger plan called Operation Himmler. German operatives, dressed in Polish military uniforms, attacked a German radio station near the Polish border in the town of Gliwice, today Gliwice, Poland. The attackers broadcasted a brief message in Polish, claiming that Poland was attacking Germany. To lend credibility to the staged incident, the Nazis killed a concentration camp prisoner, dressed him in a Polish uniform, and left him at the scene as supposed evidence of Polish aggression. This event, along with other staged incidents along the German-Polish border, was used by Hitler in his speech the next day to justify his defensive invasion of Poland. September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland. On the morning of September 1st, 1939, Germany launched a full-scale invasion of Poland, marking the official beginning of World War II. Hitler's forces employed a new military strategy known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This strategy emphasized speed, coordination, and overwhelming force, combining infantry, armored divisions, and air support to strike quickly and penetrate deeply into enemy territory. The Luftwaffe, German Air Force, bombarded Polish cities, railways, and military targets, creating chaos and cutting off Polish communications and transportation. German tanks and mechanized infantry rapidly advanced, overwhelming Polish defenses and capturing strategic positions. Blitzkrieg relied on the element of surprise and the psychological impact of rapid, relentless attacks, which left Polish forces struggling to organize a cohesive response. Within days, Germany's forces had penetrated deep into Polish territory. The Polish army, though brave and determined, was no match for Germany's modern mechanized forces. Lacking sufficient air support, heavy artillery, and anti-tank defenses, the Polish troops fought valiantly but were quickly overwhelmed. Despite fierce resistance, Polish forces found themselves retreating on multiple fronts as the German military continued its unrelenting advance. The Soviet invasion of eastern Poland. On September 17, 1939, with Poland's defenses already crumbling under the German assault, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, fulfilling its part of the secret protocol in the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Soviet forces quickly moved into eastern Poland, facing limited resistance from the already weakened Polish army. The simultaneous invasion from both Germany and the Soviet Union effectively sealed Poland's fate, splitting the country in two and preventing any chance of a prolonged defense. For the Polish people, the Soviet invasion was a brutal betrayal, as they had hoped for support from the West rather than an attack from the East. The Red Army quickly occupied the territory allocated to it by the Nazi-Soviet Pact, annexing the eastern regions of Poland. With this swift occupation, Poland was completely overrun and divided, setting a grim precedent for future Soviet and German expansions. Britain and France declare war. The invasion of Poland left Britain and France with no choice but to respond. Both nations had signed mutual defense agreements with Poland, pledging to support it in the event of an unprovoked attack. On September 3, 1939, after a series of failed ultimatums demanding Germany's withdrawal, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The declarations were somber, and the people of Britain and France, while understanding the necessity of war, dreaded what lay ahead. For many, this declaration marked the failure of diplomacy and the beginning of another devastating conflict. Despite their declarations, Britain and France were slow to take military action. The early months of World War II, known as the Phony War or Sitzkrieg, were marked by a lack of major offensives on the Western Front. Both Britain and France had yet to fully mobilize their forces, and their hesitation allowed Germany to consolidate its position in Poland and prepare for future offensives. The phony war created a sense of false hope among some that the conflict could still be resolved peacefully, but this was an illusion. Germany used this time to fortify its defenses along the Siegfried Line and plan its next moves in Scandinavia and Western Europe. For Poland, the declarations of war from Britain and France came too late. With no direct military support from the Allies, the nation was left to face occupation and brutal repression at the hands of both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The aftermath of the invasion. By October 6, 1939, Poland had been fully occupied, and its government was forced into exile. The country was divided along the lines agreed upon in the Nazi-Soviet Pact, with the western portion under German control and the eastern portion under Soviet control. For the Polish people, the occupation marked the beginning of a long and harrowing struggle, as they faced brutal oppression, forced labor, and the systematic persecution of their culture and identity. The invasion of Poland demonstrated the deadly effectiveness of blitzkrieg and showed the world that Hitler was prepared to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. It also underscored the failure of appeasement and diplomacy, as all efforts to contain Hitler had ultimately failed. With Britain and France now at war with Germany, the stage was set for a conflict that would soon spread across Europe and beyond. The importance of the invasion of Poland. The invasion of Poland was a pivotal moment that changed the course of history. It exposed the dangers of unchecked aggression and the consequences of allowing totalitarian regimes to pursue their expansionist ambitions. The world would soon realize that Hitler's vision extended far beyond Poland, and that he had no intention of stopping until his vision of a German-dominated Europe was realized. The Polish campaign also highlighted the weaknesses of traditional military defenses in the face of modern tactics like blitzkrieg, prompting the Allies to rethink their strategies. As the world plunged into war, the lessons of Poland's fall would resonate throughout the coming battles and influence the strategies of both the Axis and Allied powers. As we move to the next chapter, we will explore how the war spread across Europe, examining the early battles and strategies that would shape the course of World War II, and lay the groundwork for the global conflict that was only just beginning. Chapter 5. Initial Moves in Europe and the Phony War. After the invasion of Poland, Britain and France officially declared war on Germany, but the early months of the conflict on the Western Front were marked by a period of relative calm known as the Phony War or Sitzkrieg, sitting war. This phase, spanning from the autumn of 1939 to the spring of 1940, saw little active combat between the Allies and Germany, as both sides hesitated to make the first major move. However, beneath the surface, the warring powers were preparing for a struggle that would soon engulf Europe in full force. The Phony War. Strategic hesitation and preparation. The Phony War was an unexpected and eerie calm after the violent conquest of Poland. British and French forces positioned themselves along the Maginot Line, a heavily fortified line of defense along France's border with Germany. Constructed after World War I, the Maginot Line was intended to prevent a German invasion and to give France a defensive advantage. However, the line only covered the German-French border and did not extend along France's northern border with Belgium, leaving a potential vulnerability. Despite the declaration of war, Britain and France hesitated to launch an offensive against Germany. The memories of the trench warfare and the massive casualties of World War I made both governments cautious about a direct assault. Instead, they waited, hoping that economic pressure or a potential diplomatic breakthrough might prevent a full-scale war. The British and French also underestimated Germany's capacity for rapid offensive operations, believing that their combined forces would be able to contain any German advance in Western Europe. During this period, both Britain and France began to mobilize their economies and militaries for the conflict they feared would soon escalate. Britain increased its efforts to recruit soldiers and ramp up war production, while France fortified its defenses. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, was deployed to France to strengthen the Allied front, but a sense of complacency prevailed, as Allied commanders were unprepared for the type of warfare Germany was preparing to unleash. Germany's plans for Western Europe and the invasion of Scandinavia. While Britain and France waited on the Western Front, Germany was anything but idle. Hitler and his military commanders saw the phony war as an opportunity to secure strategic positions and resources, and to expand their influence in Europe. Concerned about maintaining access to critical resources, especially iron ore from Sweden, which was essential for Germany's war industry, Hitler turned his attention to Scandinavia. Hitler's strategy involved securing Norway and Denmark to ensure the steady flow of Swedish iron ore and to establish naval bases that would improve Germany's control over the North Sea. With control of Norway, the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, would be able to harass Allied shipping routes and strengthen Germany's defensive perimeter. Hitler also believed that by occupying Norway, he could preempt a potential British intervention in Scandinavia, as British forces had already considered plans to cut off Germany's iron ore supply from Sweden. On April 9, 1940, Germany launched Operation Weserübung, a surprise invasion of Denmark and Norway. Denmark, caught off guard by the sudden assault, surrendered within hours, recognizing that resistance was futile against the overwhelming German forces. The German occupation of Denmark was relatively swift and bloodless, and it provided Germany with a strategic foothold in the north. The invasion of Norway was more complex and met with some resistance. German forces landed in several Norwegian cities, including Oslo, Trondheim, and Narvik, while German paratroopers seized key airfields. Norway's rugged terrain and coastline provided natural defensive advantages, and Norwegian troops, supported by British and French forces, initially put up a determined resistance. However, the German forces, using their superior air power and coordination, gradually gained control. Despite their efforts, the British and French were unable to prevent the fall of Norway. Allied forces withdrew in early June 1940, leaving Norway under German occupation. The failure of the Norway campaign revealed weaknesses in Allied planning and coordination, highlighting the challenges they faced against Germany's swift and decisive operations. For the Axis, Norway was a strategic success, providing Germany with critical naval and air bases, access to Sweden's iron ore, and a stronghold from which to disrupt Allied shipping routes. The end of the phony war, and the build-up to invasion in the West. While the Allies were preoccupied with the situation in Norway, Germany was quietly planning its next major offensive in Western Europe. The initial lull on the Western Front was about to end, as Hitler and his generals finalized their strategy for the invasion of France and the Low Countries. The German High Command developed a plan that would bypass the heavily fortified Maginot Line by attacking through Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, an approach reminiscent of Germany's initial invasion strategy in World War I. Hitler's strategy for the Western Front, known as the Manstein Plan, after General Erich von Manstein, who proposed it, focused on a concentrated and rapid attack through the Ardennes forest. This region, located in southeastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg, was lightly defended by the Allies, who believed its dense forests and rugged terrain would be an unlikely route for an armored assault. Germany's plan, however, relied on the element of surprise and the use of blitzkrieg tactics to achieve a rapid breakthrough. With their forces already positioned for the assault, the Germans prepared for an invasion that would target both the Low Countries and France. Hitler saw the phony war as an opportunity to lull the Allies into a false sense of security, but he was fully committed to launching a major offensive that would cement Germany's dominance in Western Europe. The phony war came to an abrupt end in May 1940, when Germany's planned offensive began, unleashing a series of events that would fundamentally reshape the European theater of war. Impact of the invasion of Norway and Denmark. The occupation of Norway and Denmark gave Germany a significant strategic advantage, allowing it to control vital resources and secure its northern flank. The successful invasions also demonstrated Germany's capacity for rapid, coordinated operations and highlighted the challenges the Allies would face in countering blitzkrieg tactics. Additionally, the losses in Scandinavia undermined Allied morale, as it became clear that the strategies of caution and containment were ineffective against Germany's aggressive expansion. For the Allies, the failure to prevent Germany's occupation of Norway and Denmark was a sobering reminder of the cost of hesitation. The phony war period had given them valuable time to prepare, yet they had failed to act decisively, underestimating the speed and scope of Germany's ambitions. Britain and France now faced a growing realization that they needed to adopt a more proactive and adaptable approach if they were to stand a chance against Hitler's forces. The Phony War's lasting lessons. The Phony War, while seemingly an uneventful phase of the conflict, offered significant lessons for both the Allies and the Axis powers. Germany's quick and strategic victories in Scandinavia underscored the effectiveness of blitzkrieg and demonstrated that military success required speed, coordination, and the element of surprise. For the Allies, the events of this period revealed the limitations of traditional defensive strategies and highlighted the need for better intelligence, faster mobilization, and coordinated planning. As Germany prepared to launch its full-scale assault on Western Europe, the Allied powers faced a difficult and uncertain road ahead. The Phony War's end marked the beginning of a new and more intense phase of World War II, one that would test the resilience and resolve of nations across Europe. With Germany poised to unleash blitzkrieg on France and the Low Countries, the balance of power in Europe was about to shift dramatically. The lessons learned from the Phony War would shape the strategies and decisions of both the Allies and the Axis, setting the stage for the brutal and relentless battles that would define the early years of World War II. Chapter 6. The Fall of France and the Blitzkrieg in Western Europe. In May 1940, Germany launched a devastating offensive against France and the Low Countries, marking the end of the Phony War and the beginning of a brutal new phase in World War II. Using blitzkrieg tactics that had proven effective in Poland, Hitler's forces moved with unprecedented speed, overwhelming the Allies and achieving what seemed unthinkable: the rapid and total collapse of France. This defeat sent shockwaves through Europe, changing the course of the war and leaving Britain as the last major European power standing against Nazi Germany. the Manstein Plan, and the invasion of the Low Countries. The German invasion of Western Europe, known as Fall Gelb, case yellow, began on May 10, 1940, with a simultaneous assault on Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The Germans hoped to draw the bulk of French and British forces northward into Belgium, where the Allies anticipated a repeat of Germany's strategy from World War I. This feint was part of the Manstein Plan, a bold and unorthodox strategy proposed by General Erich von Manstein. While German forces attacked Belgium and the Netherlands to the north, the main thrust of the invasion was aimed at the lightly defended Ardennes Forest in southeastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg. The Allies had considered this area too rugged for a large-scale attack and had left it minimally defended. However, Hitler's forces, led by tank divisions under the command of Generals Guderian and Rommel, moved rapidly through the Ardennes, catching the Allies by surprise and breaking through their defensive lines. This strategy allowed Germany to bypass the heavily fortified Maginot Line along France's eastern border, which the French had relied on as their primary defense against a German invasion. By the time the Allies realized that the main German force was advancing through the Ardennes, it was too late to mount an effective counterattack. Blitzkrieg in action: the German advance through France. The success of the German invasion relied heavily on blitzkrieg tactics, or lightning war. This strategy involved fast-moving armored divisions supported by motorized infantry and the Luftwaffe, German Air Force, designed to overwhelm the enemy with speed, coordination, and firepower. The German tanks and mechanized units moved with incredible speed, striking deep into French territory and targeting critical points to disrupt communications, supply lines, and coordination among the Allied forces. On May 13th, German forces crossed the Meuse River near Sedan, breaking through French defenses and creating a path for the German advance into the heart of France. The Luftwaffe played a crucial role, bombarding French and British positions and preventing them from regrouping. As German tanks surged forward, the Allies were left struggling to organize a cohesive response. The relentless pace of the German advance left French and British troops encircled, and many units were forced to retreat or surrender. By May 20th, German forces had reached the English Channel, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and a large portion of the French army from the rest of France. The German advance effectively split the Allied forces in two, isolating those trapped in northern France from reinforcements in the south. This bold and unexpected maneuver demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of blitzkrieg and the shortcomings of the Allies' static defensive strategies. The evacuation of Dunkirk. With German forces advancing rapidly toward the Channel coast, the British Expeditionary Force, along with tens of thousands of French and Belgian soldiers, found themselves trapped near the port city of Dunkirk. Realizing the dire situation, the British launched Operation Dynamo, a desperate evacuation effort to rescue as many Allied troops as possible. From May 26th to June 4th, an extraordinary flotilla of British naval vessels, merchant ships, fishing boats, and civilian vessels crossed the English Channel to evacuate trapped soldiers from Dunkirk. Despite constant attacks by the Luftwaffe, which targeted the beaches and evacuation ships, the British managed to rescue over 338,000 troops. This miraculous evacuation, later called the Miracle of Dunkirk, became a symbol of resilience and unity, providing a glimmer of hope for Britain even as France was on the verge of collapse. While the evacuation saved the core of the British Army, the situation for France remained desperate. With the fall of northern France and the loss of much of the French army, the German forces advanced southward with little resistance, and the fall of Paris seemed inevitable. The fall of Paris, and France's surrender. As German forces continued their advance, the French government, led by Premier Paul Reynaud, faced a rapidly deteriorating situation. The once proud French army, which had been considered one of the strongest in Europe, was now fragmented, demoralized, and unable to mount an effective defense. Paris was declared an open city on June 14th to avoid its destruction, and German forces entered the French capital without facing resistance. With the fall of Paris, the French government moved to Bordeaux, and Reynaud soon resigned, leaving the fate of France in the hands of Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of World War I, but a man prepared to negotiate peace with Germany. Recognizing that continued resistance was futile, Pétain sought terms with Hitler. On June 22, 1940, France officially surrendered to Germany in a symbolic and humiliating ceremony held in the same railway carriage in Compiègne, where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I in 1918. The terms of the armistice were harsh. Germany would occupy the northern and western parts of France, including Paris, while a German-aligned French government would be established in the unoccupied southern zone, based in the town of Vichy. This government, known as Vichy France, was led by Pétain and collaborated with the Nazi regime, marking a painful period of division and complicity for France. Impact of France's fall on the Allied powers. The rapid defeat of France shocked the world. In a matter of weeks, Germany had defeated one of Europe's major powers, and Hitler's military machine seemed unstoppable. The fall of France left Britain isolated, facing the full might of Nazi Germany, without any significant European allies. The French defeat also provided Germany with access to France's resources, industry, and strategic ports, further strengthening its war machine and enhancing its position in Western Europe. For Britain, the fall of France marked a turning point. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had replaced Neville Chamberlain in May 1940, rallied the British people with powerful speeches, vowing to continue the fight against Germany despite the overwhelming odds. Churchill's leadership and refusal to consider peace with Hitler became a defining aspect of Britain's wartime resolve, setting the stage for the Battle of Britain and Britain's struggle to defend itself against invasion. The lessons of the Blitzkrieg and France's defeat. The swift fall of France exposed the vulnerabilities of traditional defensive strategies in the face of modern warfare. The Maginot Line, which had been expected to hold back a German invasion, proved useless once Germany bypassed it through the Ardennes. The static defenses and slow-moving strategies of the Allies were no match for Germany's mobile, coordinated forces, which exploited weak points and used air superiority to control the battlefield. Blitzkrieg tactics redefined warfare, emphasizing speed, mobility, and surprise, and these lessons would be adopted and adapted by other nations as the war progressed. The fall of France also underscored the importance of adaptability and innovation in military planning, as the Allied powers began to recognize that they would need new tactics and strategies to counter Germany's unprecedented approach to warfare. The battle ahead for Britain. With France defeated, Hitler turned his attention to Britain, hoping that the swift conquest of France would convince the British government to seek peace. However, Churchill and the British people were resolute, determined to continue the fight. Germany now faced the challenge of mounting an invasion across the English Channel. a task that would require air superiority and naval dominance. This set the stage for the Battle of Britain, as Germany's Luftwaffe prepared to wage an aerial assault to weaken Britain's defenses and pave the way for a possible invasion. The fall of France marked a critical juncture in World War II. Germany's rapid victories in Western Europe had shattered the balance of power on the continent, leaving Britain as the last bastion against Nazi domination. The Allied powers would now have to regroup, adapt, and mobilize for a long and difficult fight, as the struggle for Europe, and eventually the world, was just beginning. Chapter 7. The Battle of Britain, Defending the Last Stronghold. With the fall of France, Britain stood as the last major European power resisting Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler, emboldened by his swift conquests, believed that Britain would follow France in surrendering, or at the very least seek peace. But Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had taken office in May 1940, rallied the British people with a powerful message of defiance, making it clear that Britain would fight on, no matter the cost. This determination led to the Battle of Britain, an aerial struggle that would decide the fate of Britain and, potentially, the future course of the war. Germany's plan, Operation Sea Lion, and the need for air superiority. After France's defeat, Hitler turned his attention to Operation Sea Lion, a plan to invade Britain. However, crossing the English Channel and launching a full-scale invasion of Britain presented unique challenges. The Royal Navy was still one of the most powerful in the world, and any attempt to transport troops across the Channel would be vulnerable to British naval forces. To overcome this, Germany first needed to establish air superiority over Britain, which would allow the Luftwaffe, German Air Force, to protect German forces crossing the Channel. The Luftwaffe, under the command of Hermann Göring, was tasked with destroying Britain's Royal Air Force, RAF, and its radar and communication networks, which provided early warnings of incoming attacks. Hitler believed that if the RAF could be neutralized, Britain would be forced to surrender, or at least be weakened enough for an invasion to succeed. Thus began one of the most crucial battles of the early war, as Germany sought to bomb Britain into submission through relentless air assaults. The RAF and the role of radar. The RAF faced daunting odds. Outnumbered and with fewer aircraft, they had to defend against the Luftwaffe's larger and better-equipped force. However, the RAF had two significant advantages: radar and the resilience of its pilots. Radar technology was in its infancy, but Britain had invested in a network of radar stations along its coast, known as the Chain Home System. These radar stations allowed the RAF to detect incoming German aircraft formations early, giving them precious time to scramble fighters to intercept. The RAF's Fighter Command, led by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, strategically utilized radar information to deploy fighters efficiently. Rather than patrolling aimlessly, the RAF could concentrate its forces at specific points to intercept German bombers and fighters. This efficient use of resources helped balance the numerical disadvantage, allowing the RAF to mount an effective defense. The primary aircraft used by the RAF were the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. While the Spitfire was faster and more agile, the Hurricane was more numerous and easier to repair. Together, they became symbols of Britain's determination to defend its skies. The phases of the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain unfolded in several phases, each marked by changes in German tactics and RAF responses. The initial phase, July 1940. The Luftwaffe began by targeting shipping convoys in the English Channel and British coastal defenses. These attacks aimed to disrupt British supply routes and weaken morale. The RAF responded effectively, forcing Germany to shift tactics. The assault on airfields and radar stations, August 1940. Germany intensified its attacks on RAF airfields, radar installations, and aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe hoped to cripple the RAF by destroying its ability to launch fighters and coordinate defenses. The RAF sustained heavy losses during this phase, and several airfields were severely damaged. However, Germany underestimated the resilience of Britain's radar network, which remained largely operational despite the attacks. The Blitz, September 1940, May 1941. In early September, frustrated by the RAF's continued resistance and seeking to break British morale, Hitler ordered a change in tactics, shifting the Luftwaffe's focus to bombing London and other major cities. This phase, known as the Blitz, saw German bombers targeting civilian areas in an attempt to terrorize the British population into submission. Night after night, German bombers attacked London, causing widespread destruction and loss of life. The Blitz was devastating, with thousands of civilians killed and much of London and other cities reduced to rubble. However, instead of breaking Britain's resolve, it strengthened it. Civilians took shelter in underground stations, communities banded together, and Churchill's speeches inspired resilience. The RAF used the lull in attacks on its airfields to repair and regroup, allowing them to launch counterattacks against German bombers and regain some control over the skies. The turning point and Germany's defeat. The RAF's continued resistance, combined with Britain's ability to maintain radar operations and rebuild damaged airfields, proved critical. By mid-September, the Luftwaffe had suffered unsustainable losses. German pilots were exhausted, and the Luftwaffe was unable to achieve the air superiority necessary for Operation Sea Lion to proceed. On September 15, 1940, now known as Battle of Britain Day, the RAF dealt a decisive blow to the Luftwaffe, repelling massive waves of German bombers and fighter escorts. Seeing that his objectives were not being met, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. While the Luftwaffe continued to bomb British cities sporadically, it was clear that Germany had failed to subdue Britain. The Battle of Britain marked the first major defeat for Nazi Germany, a symbolic victory that showed the world that Hitler's forces could be resisted. The importance of the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain was a pivotal moment in World War II. It marked the first major battle fought entirely in the air, showcasing the strategic importance of air superiority in modern warfare. The RAF's resilience and Britain's determination demonstrated that Germany's military might was not invincible, inspiring other nations and laying the groundwork for future Allied resistance. Moreover, the Battle of Britain prevented Germany from achieving dominance over Western Europe. With Britain standing firm, the Allies retained a foothold in Europe from which they could later launch a counteroffensive. Britain's survival also allowed it to become a critical staging ground for American forces after the United States entered the war in 1941, facilitating the eventual Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. The battle also revealed the importance of technological advancements, with radar proving to be a decisive advantage. Britain's ability to use radar to detect incoming attacks and efficiently deploy its fighter squadrons showcased the growing role of technology in warfare, foreshadowing the even more complex innovations that would shape the rest of the conflict. The few and their legacy. The Battle of Britain left a profound legacy, immortalized in Churchill's famous tribute to the RAF pilots. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The bravery and sacrifice of the RAF pilots, many of whom were young and outnumbered, became a symbol of Britain's fighting spirit and resilience. The victory in the Battle of Britain proved that resistance against Hitler's forces was possible and inspired other nations under Nazi threat. It was a victory of courage, strategy, and technological innovation, one that demonstrated that even a formidable power like Nazi Germany could be challenged. As we move to the next chapter, we will explore how the war expanded to new fronts, with Germany shifting its focus to the east and Japan entering the conflict. The resilience shown by Britain in the Battle of Britain would set the tone for the long and challenging struggle ahead as the Allies prepared to take the fight to the Axis powers on multiple fronts. The early stages of World War II marked a period of profound change, aggression, and resilience. From the unresolved tensions left by World War I to the rise of totalitarian regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan, the world moved inexorably toward conflict. The aggressive expansion of the Axis powers went largely unchecked by the policy of appeasement, and the rapid fall of Poland, the Low Countries, and France left Britain as the last stronghold of resistance against Nazi Germany's relentless advance. The Battle of Britain, a defining moment in this dark period, revealed the power of resolve in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Britain's victory, achieved through the courage of the RAF pilots and the resilience of civilians, became a turning point that demonstrated Hitler's forces could be resisted. This battle marked the first major defeat for Nazi Germany, offering a glimmer of hope to a world in crisis. As the war expanded, the Allies were forced to adapt, to innovate, and to forge new alliances in their struggle against the Axis powers. Britain's stand inspired nations across the world, setting the stage for an unprecedented global alliance that would eventually bring the full weight of the Allied powers to bear on Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. World War II would become the deadliest conflict in human history, reshaping nations, ideologies, and the course of the 20th century. But the sacrifices made in these early battles by those who fought on land, sea, and in the air left a legacy that still resonates today, a reminder of the enduring power of courage, unity, and the unyielding spirit of those who stood for freedom. In exploring these early chapters, we glimpse not only the origins of a global conflict, but the values that would guide the Allies in their struggle and ultimately lead to victory. The story of World War II is a story of resistance, resilience, and hope, a reminder of what humanity can endure and what it can achieve when united against tyranny.